thank you all for being here. Welcome to the Humanities Centre for this next session in our series on the idea of truth. Last week's panellists, you may remember, were focused on issues concerning the critique of truth. We thought about Nietzsche, decolonization, standpoint epistemology. And this week we take this a step further still, our topic being the question of the possible death of truth altogether. And to lead our discussion today, I am happy to introduce two of my very favourite people from the Department of Philosophy. Our third panellist was due to be Dr. Steve Tamaleo, but Steve is unfortunately stricken with the flu. For those who wanted to hear something today about Foucault, as advertised, Professor Kelly has graciously agreed to my request to include some remarks on Foucault also. So our remaining and surviving panellists are, first of all, Professor Harriet Baber, who received her PhD from the Johns Hopkins University and joined USC's faculty in 1982. Her articles have appeared in such journals as Theology and Philosophical Studies, and she's been a regular columnist for both the Church Times and The Guardian. Her book, first book, The Multicultural Mystique, was published by Prometheus Books in 2008, and her new book, entitled The Trinity, A Philosophical Investigation, will be published later this year by the great SCM Press, one of my very favourite. Professor Michael Kelly received his PhD from Fordham University and taught at Boston College before joining the philosophy faculty in 2013. A specialist in 20th century continental philosophy, he has published articles in Philosophy Today, an American Catholic Philosophical Quarterly, has edited 3 volumes of papers, and is the author of a book entitled Phenomenology and the Problem of Time, published by Palgrave in 2016. We are delighted really to have you both with us today, so please give a warm welcome to Professors Baber and Kelly.
All right. Thanks, Brian, and thanks to Brian and Lindy for all the good work they're doing for us here at the Humanities Center. I'm happy to have a chance to talk about the death of truth and a little bit trepid about having agreed to talk about Foucault. So I'm kind of actually just going to give 2 separate presentations, one followed by the other, to try to keep the topics separated. The first one is really just going to be an overview, a sketch of Foucault's thought and some of his main themes. And I wanted to start with a quotation from a work of Foucault's called Power Knowledge. He writes the following: each society has its regime of truth, its general politics of truth, that is, the type of discourse which it accepts and makes function as true, the techniques and procedures according to value in the acquisition of the true, and the status of those who are charged with saying what counts as true. Close quote. This is kind of a preface. It is hard for me to say what Foucault's relationship to truth was. On the one hand, it is clear that he thinks that there is no transcendent absolute truth underlying reality behind our social constructs. And as we shall see regarding his work, he extends that claim to a suspicion about so-called scientific objectivity. He thinks there is no pure reason and that knowledge and power always interact with one another. For Foucault, what we think is, say, nature or natural or the way things are, is just psychologically or politically motivated features of our talk about truth. There is no such thing as truth independent of its particular regime. On the other hand, Foucault was a philosophical historian and a thinker always deeply committed to preserving the value of freedom. He studied carefully, if not creatively, the human sciences and civic institutions that he believed threatened freedom. And specifically, he studied those institutions that deal with mental illness, punishment, and sexuality because he found those to be especially threatening to freedom. Of his motivation behind his work, he writes again in Power Knowledge, quote, I had a certain amount of practical experience in psychiatric hospitals and was aware of the combats, the lines of force and tension and points of collision which existed there, and my historical work was undertaken only as a function of these conflicts to produce a discourse which would be both true and strategically effective, a truth which could have a political effect. That's closing the quote. So 2 values here seem to be espoused in Foucault's own writings, truth and freedom. His work, on the one hand, aims to liberate the marginalized, and yet his work is anti-progressivist And so it is hard for me to just say what is Foucault's relationship to truth. In any case, I think that I can say that his critical theory is provocative in the best sense. And what I want to try to do is sketch his view of history, the way that he used history, his major works, and some of the major technical terms in his works. For Foucault, the past was not something to be explored for its own sake. Foucault thought that history isn't something to be read in some disinterested way to learn how things were in the past. For Foucault, history was something like a storehouse of good ideas that we could use to interrogate our current norms, values, and projects. We don't study history for its own sake, but for the benefits historical events might give us to promote better life in the today or the present. Foucault, as a philosophical historian, would look back to the past in order to diagnose the present. He thus rejected conventional approaches to history. For example, rather than, say, explore the historical circumstances that led to Galileo's imprisonment by the Catholic Church, he wanted to examine the social constraints on thought that made it impossible for a community to resist and reject the heliocentric worldview. His philosophical history then is not a tracing and an ordering of facts in order to hermeneutically or interpretively uncover their deeper meaning. There was no deeper meaning, just the meaning contingent to those times. He thus did not make empirical generalizations, but tried to construct a general mode of thinking that laid behind the diverse beliefs and practices of different epochs in Western culture. Foucault's philosophical history was interested in the structures and the norms that form the context for thinking for a particular time, and that constrain how people are able to think and behave in a particular time. To be now a bit more specific as it relates to his works, he attempts to critique the power of modern bourgeois capitalist state. The focus of his critique is more specifically the modern human sciences, the biological sciences, the psychological sciences, and the social sciences. These purport to offer universal scientific truths about human nature that are, in fact, in Foucault's view, often mere expressions of ethical and political commitments of a particular society. Foucault's critical philosophy undermines such claims by exhibiting how they are the outcome of contingent historical forces and not scientifically grounded truths. Foucault then will look for sources of power that disguise themselves as nothing more than disinterested knowledge characterized by evidence or purportedly value-neutral objective data or facts. On Foucault's view, modernity gives the appearance of progress, say more humane treatment of subjects like the mad or the criminal, but it hides how it constructs exclusionary categories under those supposedly objective sciences. Foucault seems to think that if we can see that previous epochs of history thought differently about the same issues, say the mad or the criminally constituted, then this will shake us free from the shackles of thought that hold to our contemporary beliefs that this is just how things are. Each of his major books is a critique of historical reason in this sense with this aim. Madness and Civilization, his first major work in 1961, makes the claim that we today treat the mentally ill in more humane ways than we used to. But Foucault notes in that work that the mad actually used to have a certain kind of difference rather than a certain kind of circumscribed view as crazy. The mad were thought prior to modernity to illustrate or manifest the limits of reason, to give a different way into truth. But in the mid-17th century, he argues, we medicalize and institutionalize the mentally ill and lock them into asylums so that society can cure and treat them rather than tolerate them and value their difference in the different way they viewed reality. In The Birth of the Clinic in 1963, he targets more broadly in the same way the discipline of medicine as a whole. Medicine itself does not also become more humane with time, according to Foucault. In the 18th century, the professional doctor arises and, on his view, dehumanizes the person by taking the person as a set of organs rather than as a whole, as a person. And I think what is his most famous work, Discipline and Punish, 1975, he suggests that penal systems are more humane than the previous institutions of power and punishment would have had them prior to modernity. Power and punishment in medieval times used to look more violent and unkind, but today they appear less violent and more kind. This shift minimizes, on Foucault's reading, the possibility for rebellion against power, The modern system of power is, on his view, thus more barbaric to the extent that it is more hidden from the public view. Moreover, on his view, punishment used to make the few visible to the many in order to demonstrate a moral or a legal point. But modern punishment seeks to make the many visible to the few in order to generate normalcy in the name of control. You have to forgive me, I'm trying to get my pages together. In the history of sexuality, 1976 to 1984, Foucault is concerned with the supposed liberation of sexuality that makes it more medicalizable and more visible, but not more tolerated. He identifies how the norms of, say, monogamy, heterocentrism, etc., correspondingly set up their other as deviant, that is to say, the polygamist, the promiscuous, the homosexual, the bisexual. And hence the history of sexuality on his account, the history of sexuality on his account expresses political categories created in the service and the promotion of core societal elements such as family, economy, and political management. In each of these works, Foucault is concerned with the formal constraints on our thinking and freedom as they follow from what he calls an episteme or a discourse. These are technical terms in Foucault. He introduces this term episteme to identify what he calls the largely unconscious assumptions concerning the intellectual order of the day. These systems of thought and belief are governed by rules and norms that operate, on his view, beneath an individual's awareness. And since we have to dig into history to discover this episteme, Foucault refers to his method or his methodology as an archaeology or a genealogy. And I'll have a comment about that in conclusion. An episteme gives us the sense of order in our world or the frame of reference for our times. It is, on Foucault's view, thus culturally constructed, and it is most visible in what he calls a discourse. A discourse is roughly a historically contingent social system that produces knowledge and meaning within an episteme. A discourse can take the form of an overt set of rules, say law or scientific method, or knowledge, say an academic discipline, or power, say tacit practices and norms that coerce and curb behavior. Discourses, he thinks, kind of do two things. First, they express and enact the authority of those in power to use the discourse, say like a doctor or an administrator using technical terms and acronyms that are unknown to the patient or to the person seeking some service by the administrator. And secondly, that discourse subordinates and excludes those outside of the discourse. Again, the patient to the doctor, the male to the female, the manager to the employee, the administrator to the person seeking a license at the DMV. The more dominant or entrenched a discourse, the more natural its values seem to be, and the more objective its truth claims seem to be. Foucault's point seems to be that a dominant discourse appears to reflect the nature of things or truth rather than the power of those authorized to administer the discourse. One could say in this way that discourse has an effect of putting you in your place, as it were. It normalizes. Discourse makes you into a subject, and it makes you into a subject in two ways. On the one hand, you are subject to it, and on the other hand, it gives you your subjectivity or identity, the categories according to which you are marked or identified. And for Foucault, that which does not conform to the particular epistemes, structures of truth or discourse, that which is outside of or resists the epistemes discourse, is considered abnormal and deviant, say cognitively, criminally, or sexually. So to try to kind of make this a little bit more concrete, I want to just look at discipline and punish in particular to see how these notions play out. In Discipline and Punishment, Foucault argues that modern punishment is more humane in its quest for total control. The quote that he uses is telling. He says, modern punishment does not wish, quote, to punish less, but to punish better, close quote. Pre-modern punishment, he believes, was violent, but satisfied itself with retribution or its proverbial pound of flesh. Modern forms of punishment want to change the mind of the criminal in order to control the body. Another quote of Foucault's, which I always found telling, the soul is the prison of the body. Modern systems of punishment for Foucault want to produce something in particular, and he calls that particular thing docile bodies. Docile bodies are bodies that are actually in action. They're not docile or immobile. They're in action, but they are doing what we want them to do, how we want them to do it. Much like you would see somehow like in the military or I think of Stanley Kubrick's presentation of boot camp in the film Full Metal Jacket, or I think of the Language Matters seminars for college first-year students, which used to be called freshmen. There are 3 techniques that Foucault identifies for producing docile bodies, and these disciplinary techniques are found in the military and in prisons, but on his view, they extend throughout society to schools, to factories, to hospitals, and so on, with things like rap sheets and dossiers and transcripts and health charts and so on. The first of these techniques he calls hierarchical observation. He follows Jeremy Bentham's notion of the panopticon, which was this kind of large cylindrical apparatus in the middle of a prison in the 19th century that actually could, by virtue of being centrally located, permit the prison guard to see all of the prisoners at once, but none of the prisoners could actually see into the panopticon. This has the effect of permitting us in some respects to both police ourselves because we have the threat of constant surveillance. And so we actually think that we're being looked at, whether we're being looked at or not. And so the body conforms to the behavior that the warden desires the body conform to. This is not just in prison, but something like the panopticon occurs in tiered lecture hall seating where we permit students to police themselves, or at least permit us to be able to see them on their iPhones. The reality of big data, electronic footprints and NSA surveillance. In all of these instances, since we could be being watched, but we don't know if we are being watched, we live with a sense of permanent visibility that promotes our docility or conformity. The second condition that he applies, or the technique that he identifies in modern forms of punishment, is what is called normalizing judgments. Right? Now, normalizing judgments are not a judgment of the rightness or the wrongness of an action, but they are a judgment of where you fit on a comparative scale or an average, right? Anyone who has a child has known that their child from the time they're born is measured. The infant measures in the 90th percentile or the 50th percentile. The tracking of the language of the child is measured according to the developmental scales of modern science, and if they're not reading by the time they're 5 years old, their chances for future prospects are obviously completely undermined. That was a joke. Child's reading at the 50th percentile, ridiculous indices which don't work, like body mass index that fat shame us, average consumer debt, average consumer retirement holdings, average number of alcoholic beverages a day, which I always thought was a bit low, percentages of people your age with a mood disorder, and so on. Some of this gets as trivial in modern society as things like this sheer rankings of everything, America's most walkable cities, whatever this means, and the average number of sexual partners by whatever age is considered to be appropriate for that number of sexual partners. The normal sets the abnormal in this respect. The third technique that he identifies is what he calls the examination or the network of writing, and by the look of the crowd, every one of us in here has suffered those. This is a combination of the first 2 techniques, actually, and it really is a record about the truth or the normality or abnormality of where we sit with respect to the normalizing judgments that are being hierarchically observed now by the network of writing. Health records, attendance records, IQ tests, electronically scored test scores, and so on and so forth. The combination of these 2 techniques in the form of the network of writing will become something like Foucault's notion, which is now quite famous and often invoked and unfortunately not explained terribly well, and I'm not going to do much better, the notion of biopower or biopolitics. Biopower denotes the administrative regulation of life and the process whereby power creates subjects through a system of classification and management. No one for Foucault escapes the network of power and normalization. Power is dispersed throughout the society. We are all its victims and all its promoters. So what in the end is truth for Foucault? Dominant discourse, or prevailing truth, or some regime in some epoch? I think I can say for sure that the normal is the prevailing truth and the abnormal or the deviant or the criminal is the untruth, whatever that might mean. The normal is the center, the abled, the masculine, the hetero, the white. The abnormal is the marginalized, the disabled, the feminine, the non-hetero, the non-white, and so on. And I think that there is actually much to be gained from Foucault's critical analyses. First, we can learn that things that appear to be true or natural or necessary are only one perspective and perhaps even not true or contingent. Second, Foucault thinks that the marginalized can meaningfully challenge the normal or the central. And in this way, Foucault's liberal assumption is that self-critique and respect for the marginalized and the other should be at the center of our political worldview. Foucault does seem to be giving us another perspective on history, telling the narrative in another way, but his claims are not empirical claims, but instead, I think, something like a cultural psychoanalysis of an episteme. Thanks, that's what I've got to say about Foucault. All right, now my second talk is on the death of truth. I've titled it The Death of Truth, an Autoimmunitary Process. I'm mocking Derrida. I've written this paper with a general thought in view. I think that the problem with postmodernism isn't postmodernism per se. Rather, the problem with postmodernism is that it is too often discussed and too often taught without attention to the senses of truth and objectivity that postmodernism questions. When postmodernism is presented too generally as a bland rejection of truth, it is easily dismissed and perhaps even ridiculable. And it is that bland or general version of postmodernism, the one that is too often taught and too often discussed, that I'm going to reject in this essay. On my view, truth is not dead, never has been, never will be. The view of the death of truth follows primarily from Nietzsche's declaration of the death of God and truth. Since the turn of the 20th century with Nietzsche, this view grew in popularity and into a position of celebrity, even of reverence. From the 1960s forward, after a group of United States higher education academicians arranged for some new French imports that would come to be labeled, somewhat anachronistically, postmodern. I'm alluding to the 1966 Johns Hopkins Conference, The Language of Criticism and the Science of Man, that introduced to the American Academy the then new French thought. It is not until 1979, however, that Jean-Francois Lyotard coins the term postmodern. By then, the big three of postmodernism, the philosophers Foucault, Derrida, and Deleuze, with their respective techniques of archaeology, deconstruction, and the logical multiplicities, had been on the international intellectual scene for over a decade. Today, while postmodern post-structuralism occupies only a very small space in philosophy departments, it shapes profoundly literary studies, cultural studies, ethnic studies, gender studies, religious studies, film studies, architecture, art history, anthropology, some strands of political science, sociology, and communications. It has reached into the culinary arts with deconstructed flourless chocolate cakes, and contemporary conversations around identity politics presume its premises, and those both in favor of and against must contend with the premises and buzzwords in terms of arts of postmodern post-structuralism that inform identity politics. My point of this rehearsal is to say that it is increasingly important today that it be studied deeply rather than just overviewed or presumed. Now, one place to start is to examine closely the implications of espousing the death of truth in the bland sense that I mentioned at the outset. That, I think, is a dangerous thing to do. Postmodernism declares the death of truth based on the belief that each of our philosophical, contemporary theological, sociological, historical, political, anthropological, literary, positivistic, scientific theories only can provide partial presentations of the whole, or reality, or truth. Each constructs and only can construct its partial perspective on the whole of reality or meaning, that is to say, the truth. Now, when one perspective purports to have presented the whole of reality or meaning, that is to say, the truth, postmodernism labels this a meta-narrative. That's a technical term. Now, a meta-narrative goes beyond or claims to transcend any other particular narrative and thus excludes or subordinates other narratives to its transcendent version of the truth. Lyotard actually characterizes postmodernism as a, quote, incredulity toward meta-narratives, close quote. Notable examples of meta-narratives are Plato's allegory of the cave, the Christian redemption narrative, modern science providing evidence and liberating humanity from the Dark Ages, Marx's liberating proletariat revolution, and so on. Postmodernism's challenge is to show that a meta-narrative always lacks immunity to the methods of archaeology, deconstruction, or the logical multiplicities. And it is in this sense, it is in this specific philosophical sense, and only in this sense that we should hear and do hear declarations of the death of truth. I'll come back to that point later. Now, this kind of inflated rhetoric of the death of truth does postmodernism no favors. What we shall examine is whether or not truth is shown to be immune to postmodernism's autoimmunity critique, and if postmodernism conceptually achieves its end or suffers its own autoimmune disorder. We shall see three ways in which the system undermines itself like an organism's immune system eating itself from the inside. First, the denial of truth is self-refuting. Second, and following from the first, the rejection of non-perspectival standards undermines the social, ethical, political agenda postmodernism wishes to promote. And third, and following from the first two, their critical methodology leaves us with power as what I want to call the arbitrary arbiter of the true and the legitimate, and I'm going to treat each of these points in turn. Any declaration of the death of truth performatively contradicts itself. If the declarer intends the declaration to mean that there really is no truth, then she finds herself embroiled in a contradiction to the extent that she expresses one truth precisely in the very declaration of the death of truth. Now, if to avoid the contradiction, the speaker insists that her declaration too is untrue, then we may disregard her declaration of the death of truth for two related reasons. First, the claim that what she says is both true and not true is meaningless. And second, if her claim too is not true, then she hasn't provided any reason to hold that all other claims are not true. So either she herself declares a truth, or we may disregard her declaration of the truth, and in both cases, truth lives on. Let's come at our examination of the declaration of the death of truth from different perspectives. Let us say, as I think it is often the case in practice, that the declaration of the death of truth is meant rhetorically or polemically. Let's say, that is, that a prophet of the death of truth deploys such a claim to shake her community out of some type of dogmatic slumber and into reflection about existing doctrines or worldviews that attempt to pass themselves off as the truth or the prevailing truth. The rhetorical polemical declaration of the death of truth aims to criticize the status quo, prevailing, dominant, and here's the word of the day, hegemonic view of truth. And it does this precisely in order to liberate other senses of truth or a group or a worldview unjustly deemed subordinate to or excluded from the prevailing view of truth. Indeed, the critical view of postmodernism is that what attempts to pass itself off as truth is really just a claim to purported truth or objectivity that is, quote, secretly in the service of the maintenance of the power, economic and other, of somebody or other, rather than any truth, close quote. Those who declare the death of truth thus emphasize alternatively the fact that we always speak from a particular context, and thus should emphasize, quote, the importance of listening to different voices and perspectives, especially those oppressed or marginalized by authorities of whatever sort, close quote. The truth of freedom, justice, and equality, thus in my mind, seems assumed in postmodernism's critical view. Now, if a proponent of postmodernism still insists that such truth is dead and that only various perspectives remain, the common objection arises. This is just a bland version of relativism, and as such, it cannot achieve its noble aims of justice, equality, and freedom. A defender of postmodernism surely would note that this charge of relativism, and with it the correlative claim that the major premise of postmodernism precludes it from realizing its noble aims, rests on a facile comic book version of postmodernism. In defense of postmodernism against this common charge, let's leave aside the relativism objection for two reasons. First, I think that one who wishes to emphasize the importance of listening to different voices can simultaneously hold that such claims have no truth value and yet resolve to give voice to the marginalized. Second, and more importantly for me, its aims are desirable. No one who thinks, I think, would dispute postmodernism's noble aims of divorcing power from truth and promoting justice, freedom, and equality. Such a concession nevertheless leaves postmodernism at an undesirable impasse. The postmodernist's desire to give voice to the marginalized must assume that such restitution is good and must provide, beyond mere critical analysis, some positive theory about how to realize such goods. On the best interpretation following from its own terms, the postmodernist cannot assert a good once liberated as anything more than a good that now coexists with the pre-existing good of, say, the colonizer. Now, I suppose that is some kind of an improvement, but, as the eminent postmodern philosopher of religion Merrill Westphal once noted, neo-Nazi groups remain marginalized. Now, surely that isn't the group that postmodernism, or anyone else for that matter, has in mind when emphasizing the value of giving voice to the marginalized. The premise of the death of truth does not equip postmodernists with the theoretical resources adequate to the task of demarcating the good from the bad, the desirable from the deplorable marginalized. Now, since postmodernism cannot properly circumscribe the domain of the marginalized to whom one should give voice, it does not seem adequate to the task of liberation. Such a counterexample may be said to misunderstand postmodernism, or it may be invalidated by various aspersions such as logocentrism, logophallocentrism, logophalo-heteronormativity, etc. And even if we grant this rejoinder, a problem remains for those who endorse the equal legitimacy of any and all coexisting narratives, which, I remind you, conceptually necessarily includes the deplorable, fanatical, extremist neo-Nazi narrative. According to a worldview that denies truth in order to legitimate coexisting in different narratives, postmodern post-structuralism cannot adequately account for how it does not leave us with the very problem from which it sought to liberate us, namely, the circumstance in which power passes itself off as truth. As the noted postmodern post-structuralist Celia Benabi put the matter, quote, "Transcendental guarantees of truth are dead. There are no criteria of truth transcending local discourses, but only the endless struggle of local narratives vying with one another for legitimation," close quote. In short, postmodernism leaves us only with contending, competing, or vying, and legitimation will be nothing other than power passing itself off as such. Power then is the final arbitrary arbiter of the true, the prevailing truth, or the truth that prevails in the vying and the battling. Consider Charles Taylor's interrogation of the French Nietzsche and Foucault's endeavor to expose truth and reclaim freedom. This is a fairly long quotation, but it's, I think, forceful. Quote, "Foucault's historical analyses seem to offer a critique and hence some notion of a good unrealized or repressed in history, which therefore we better understand how to rescue. Foucault's analyses seem to bring evils to light, and yet he wants to distance himself from this suggestion, that the negation or the overcoming of these evils promotes a good. More specifically, Foucault's analyses lay bare a modern system of power that lies partly in the fact that it is not seen as power, but as science or as fulfillment, even liberation. Now, you would think that implicit in all this was a notion of two goods which need rescuing, and which Foucault's analyses help us to rescue, freedom and truth. But Foucault seems to repudiate both. There is no truth which can be espoused, defended, or rescued against systems of power. On the contrary, each such system defines its own variant of truth, and there is no escape from power into freedom, for such systems of power are coextensive with human society," close quote. In short, I am afraid, according to post-structuralism and postmodernism, we cannot speak truth to power. So let's try to deflate postmodernism's highly inflated declaration of the death of truth. If postmodernism's critique of meta-narratives challenges any theory that purports to know the whole from its partial standpoint, then we have not a declaration of the death of truth, but a reminder that truth, or how things are, is said in many ways. On the best view of postmodernism, it is perhaps Socratic. Each is an ironic gadfly who stings his or her target, so that the targeted will perhaps avoid the most blameworthy ignorance of thinking that one knows what one does not really know, and thus complacently allowing dominant groups to dictate justice, equality, and freedom. Here's another way to develop the analogy of the similarity between Socrates and postmodernism. Socrates examined the professional academicians of the day. These were called the relativistic sophists, and the average Athenian, the poet, the politician, the craftsman. And he did this in order to ensure that they do not presume an authority or a rectitude about their worldview when it may be just an illegitimate extension of their knowledge-based skill set or privilege. The postmodernist examines the professional philosopher or theorizer who purports to present a grasp of the whole of reality or how things really are, the truth, and targets the effectiveness of a theory's concepts, categories, and language to adequately reflect the way the world appears to the mundane agent, that is to say, a person in everyday life. Perhaps at its best, postmodern post-structuralism does not permit any one discipline to imperialize the other discourses or voices. It exposes as idolatrous any one worldview or philosophical system that attempts to reify or deify itself. But Socrates, and here the disanalogy comes in, Socrates never threw the baby of truth out with the bathwater of unreflective dogmatism. And while Socrates' irony never tells us what to think, postmodernism is formally, tacitly prescriptive to the extent that it holds, again tacitly and without argument, that any truth or justice deserving of the name will take the side of and even overcorrect to give voice to the marginalized, the oppressed, and the excluded. For all the merits in its ambitions to guard against one perspective imperializing the other, postmodern post-structuralism threatens to make a graver version of the mistake of which it accuses the meta-narratives of philosophy and the positivistic sciences. Modern philosophy's rationalism and modern science's scientism have long invalidated the everyday. Each often tries to substitute its truth for the naive truth of mundane life, It claims to enlighten the mundane or the everyday with its real truth gained by following its unique method or system of thought. Postmodern post-structuralism itself seeps into the mundane when, going beyond its forefathers' critiques of the disciplines of modern philosophy and science, it turns an attack on academic pretensions to truth into a critique of truth itself, and it extends the voice of one discipline or perspective into that of another. In assuming its suspicious social political critique, postmodernists often politicize everything. And as such, postmodernism imperializes the discipline of politics. It often psychologizes everything, and as such, it imperializes the discipline of psychology. Indeed, postmodernism politicizes and imperializes any discipline in which a member of some discipline assumes postmodern post-structuralism as his or her theoretical point of orientation and, for example, attempts to make interpretations of Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse or the Gospel of John about politics rather than literature or theology. Postmodern post-structuralism even politicizes public everyday discourse when in the media and on social media it turns conversations about civil society into identity politics. Now, Derrida, I think, would issue a warning to anyone practicing postmodernism in this way. Derrida himself has said that he, quote, and this is really important, he, quote, never accepted saying or encouraging others to say just anything at all, close quote. And Derrida has only said that there could be no ultimate unity or coherence to a text or theory itself. His interrogations of the claims of philosophy and modern science are not directed at the everyday. They are not meant to invalidate or substitute for the disciplines of other courses of study or the everyday way in which we engage the world. Derrida's deconstruction does not take aim at the everyday and its other-oriented ethical values. Derrida's deconstruction does not take aim at the realities or the values themselves. It takes aim at a theory's concepts and categories that purport to adequately capture those values and truths. In the name of a justice and a truth beyond deconstruction, that's Derrida's own phrase, the pursuit of a justice or truth beyond deconstruction, Derrida Socratically issues an injunction to vigilant, careful, close readings of the way that any one theory names justice or truth. His deconstruction reminds us that our best concepts and theories for presenting the truth, justice, and goodness will be both myriad and in need of constant examination. He thus insists, quote, deconstruction is justice, close quote. As such, Derridians often offer deconstructive etymologies of attractive, other-oriented values that aim to articulate the values of truth and justice that exist beyond deconstruction. Derrida actually himself attacks the values of hospitality and community. Of hospitality, Derrida might say, and has said, it entails power differentials, as we see from the second half of the word deriving from potus, or power. And indeed, hospitality entails acceptance, but not in some sense inclusion. Since today we want inclusion, what about community, which seems to accommodate the aim of inclusion? What indeed about community when, the deconstructionist might remind us, the root word munis means defense or munitions, and hence community, a defense of the common, or the cum. How can community thusly considered robustly regard and include the other? Since such deconstruction invites us not to demean our ethics by turning them into bland banalities or slogans complacently deployed as acceptable talking points regarding the marginalized, what might we say of today's trending ideal of inclusion? I want to close with my own quick deconstruction of this contemporary value thought to convey concern for the other. The noun inclusion, from the Latin inclusionum, from the nominative inclusio, means a shutting up or confinement, or perhaps only a bit better, an act of making a part of. Consider the verb to include, which etymologically means to shut someone or something in materially, to enclose, imprison, or confine, or to have something as a constituent part of, from the Latin includere, to shut in, enclose, imprison, insert, from the prefix in and the root claudere, to shut. Is inclusion an objective about which we shouldn't have some uneasiness, or at least to which we should give some more thought? Is it really what postmodernists concerned with social justice really desire? If proponents of inclusion want to be a constitutive part of or to be made part of something, what is that something? It would not seem to be the society or institution that postmodernism deems exclusionary, marginalizing, or oppressive. So proponents of inclusion, if they should exist at all, actually wants something different than what their slogans communicate. If it wants inclusion in a system fundamentally altered. And what, very importantly, should we say of institutions such as, and perhaps especially universities, that promote this ideal? What might they intend when they promote the ideal of inclusion? Might an institution's promotion of inclusion, understood etymologically, be a specious canard or a euphemism that conveys a desire to assimilate or placate the other? I cannot say. What I can say and will say, however, is this. If postmodern deconstruction does not deny truth, but instead invite us to reflect on how complacency about our theories and convictions might run against truth, then I will read along, and I will read along carefully. After all, this is really nothing other than what the best of the liberal arts and sciences have always called us to do. On the other hand, if postmodernism denies the existence of a truth that is immune to or exists beyond deconstruction, then so much the worse for it. And I will happily privilege a philosophy with a different voice. Thank you.
Great, okay. So I'm addressing the question of whether truth is relative, and my response is yes, no, and maybe, okay? The kind of view that I'm going to defend is what I'd like to call conceptual pragmatism. And this is the description of this kind of view that comes from C.I. Clarence Irving Lewis, who is an American philosopher writing in the first part of the 20th century. And it's the kind of view that I think would find a lot of sympathy among most analytic philosophers, as I am myself. Now, analytic philosophy is not a quote-unquote school of philosophy. It is generic, plain vanilla philosophy, the philosophy that most people who call themselves philosophers have done, right? And that includes Plato when he's doing philosophy and not engaging in cosmological speculation. Aristotle, most of the time, apart from the time that he's engaging in speculative a priori biology. It's the philosophy that was done by the scholastics ecumenically, by Christian scholastics like Aquinas, Duns Scotus, Occam, by Jewish scholastics like Maimonides, by Islamic scholastics like Averroes and Avicenna, and all through up to and including Kant. Then something kind of went wrong for a few decades, and there was Hegel and this kind of thing. Okay? But now we are back on track. And if you want to know who isn't an analytic philosopher, I would start with Foucault. Okay? So this is the generic kind of view. This is what we do. And when I say yes, no, maybe, yes, truth is relative to a conceptual scheme, to our way of structuring and organizing the world of experience, to our way of describing it. Yes. Maybe. Okay, because some conceptual schemes are better than others. Okay, they're better for prediction and explanation, for doing science. They're better for convenience, for getting around in the world and predicting how things are going to go, avoid bumping into walls, stuff like that. So some conceptual schemes are better than others. And we work, and this is a pragmatic matter, what will work for us? What will suit our purposes as human beings? And I assume that there are some purposes that we have in common, like survival, convenience, enjoying ourselves, okay? And the final thing is no, because once we adopt a conceptual scheme, and this isn't an individual matter, it's a matter of our social world. Our social world embodies a conceptual scheme in the language that we use to communicate with one another. And once we buy into a conceptual scheme, we play by the rules. So the text of my sermon, which will be a relatively short one, because I'm Episcopalian and no sermon lasts more than 30 minutes. Okay? So the text of my sermon comes from the Strawberry Alarm Clock. Who cares what games we choose, what conceptual schemes, what language games we choose? Little to win and nothing to lose. Okay? So let's start with yes, right? Truth is relative to a conceptual scheme. And the kind of picture, the metaphor for this kind of view is the picture of reality as an amorphous lump. So the idea is that reality is sort of this unstructured whatever, right? The metaphor used by William James, who's very much in this tradition, writing at the beginning of the 20th century, is that the world as it is, apart from our conceptual schemes, beyond our conceptual schemes, can be understood as a blooming, buzzing confusion. Okay? He thought of this, or he suggested that this was the way a newborn infant saw the world. Now, as a matter of empirical fact, this is not the way newborn infants see the world, but the idea here is if you had no language, if you had no way of organizing or structuring the world of experience, experience would present itself as a blooming, buzzing confusion. Okay? Now, on this kind of account, there is a way things are, a fact of the matter outside of language. But we can describe it. We can hack up that buzzing, blooming confusion in different ways, many different ways, many different conceptual schemes, many different games. Another metaphor that gets used, going back to the amorphous lump metaphor, is that the stuff out there is sort of like dough, and we can cut it up in a variety of different ways. Our conceptual schemes cut that world up. They clump things together. Think of this world of experience, right? Imagine yourself falling asleep and everything is sort of fluid and mushy, okay? Well, we can cut it up in different ways. And the cutters are linguistic items, okay? We cut things up in different ways. For example, here, of course, this is a trick question, so you don't have to answer it. How many things are there? Well, one answer is 3, A, B, and C. That's one way of cutting things up. But you can also say 7, because there's A, B, C, A plus B, B plus C, A plus B plus C. So we can cut things up different ways. And to ask about things, how many things, that's an unanswerable question, because you have to specify what kinds of things. In other words, you have to introduce terms that classify and chunk up bits of reality. And these terms are what we call sortals. One of my favorite words, it comes from John Locke in his discussion of personal identity. So the kind of view that I'm suggesting, right, is that everything is something or other. This is a view called mereological, not be confused with mereological. Mereological universalism. Mereological means pertaining to parts and wholes. So a logic of part and wholehood is called mereology. And the idea here is, okay, we can chunk things up using the terminology that we use as cookie cutters in different ways. We can chunk things up as iron, espresso pot, glove, or we can chunk things up in different ways. We can say, okay, biscuit tin plus espresso thing, okay? We can chunk things up like one glove plus pumpkin. We can call it a schmumpkin or whatever we want, right? The world is full of stuff, right? And we chunk it up according to our convenience, according to our conceptual scheme. So we choose, okay, we choose our sortals, we choose the cookie cutters. We choose the words that chunk up bits of reality and that classify the chunks once we've chunked them. Okay, car. I really like this car. Right? I really want it. Okay, that's one kind of sortal. It chunks things up as cars. But we can chunk things up differently. We can chunk them up as in cars and out cars. And this comes from Eli Hirsch, who's a contemporary philosopher who holds the kind of conceptual, pragmatic view that I'm suggesting here. So an in car is a car in a garage. An out car is a car outside of a garage. We could do that. Well, you might ask, what happens when you drive out of the garage? Well, in car shrinks and out car is created and grows. Okay. And when you've gotten all the way out, in car no longer exists. It has disappeared. And what do you know? You are now the proud owner of a brand new red out car. Okay? Why not play that game? Pick your sortals. Who cares what language games we choose? We can play the car game, or we can play the in-car, out-car game by adopting different sortal cookie cutters. But But some ways, and here's the maybe aspect, right? Some ways of chunking and classifying suit our purposes better than others. In-car, out-car, that's pretty problematic because you ask questions like, when should I change my oil? And then there are issues of title and registration and all kinds of ways that adopting the in-car, out-car scheme is less convenient and suits our purposes less well than adopting the car scheme. Okay? So some schemes suit our purposes better than others. Some games, we gain something by playing those games. Okay? What are our purposes? Well, let's see, survival, that's something I think we can probably agree on. Convenience, very inconvenient to operate with in-car, out-car. Car is really works out better. Very important for the purposes of doing science, explanation and prediction, right? So ways of classifying things, some work better than others. Communication, getting what we want, because we all want to be on the same page. We want to adopt the same conceptual scheme for the purposes of our social interaction and our communication with one another, and so that we collaboratively can advance knowledge and science. Okay, so little to win, nothing to lose. We want the winning game, the game that suits our purposes, the game that's best for our pragmatic purposes. Okay, now, there are some don't cares. There are some peripheral don't cares where we can have a little bit of wiggle room when it comes to our conceptual schemes. For example, I say tomato, you say tomato, and we can classify these tomatoes as fruit or veg for different purposes. For botanical purposes, they're fruit. They hang on a stalk, they have seeds inside, they're fruit. But for grocery purposes, if you go to Albertsons, they're in the vegetable department, and it really doesn't matter, right? So sometimes our scheme of classification, different schemes suit different purposes for these minor peripheral issues. Or take mountains and islands. Not only can we classify things differently within limits, but it's okay, we can chunk things together differently, right? So here's a mountain, right? This great big thing is one thing. But what happens with global warming when the sea level rises? Okay? And now what we have is an island. And the island just consists of this stuff. We don't care what's underwater, or should we care what's underwater? Should we say that the island extends all the way to the sea floor, right? Since after all, that's the way it was before the sea level rose. Well, it doesn't really matter because these are peripheral issues. But sometimes it does matter, right? So when it comes to biological classifications, we got the idea for the purposes of explanation and prediction in the sciences that it was desirable to classify the whale as a mammal rather than as a fish. And as I understand it now, because I checked my favorite source, Wikipedia, the scheme for biological classification has become vastly more complicated since high school days when there were 3 kingdoms, the 2 like animals and plants, and then there were these things, protists, which was everything else, right? And now I checked Wikipedia and it's so confusing I can't figure it out, but that's how science progresses. Some schemes of classification work better for these purposes than others. Okay? Now, that was maybe, now no. Because once we adopt the conceptual scheme, and when I say we, I mean all of us. I mean us as social beings involved in the corporate exercise of communication and the corporate business of doing science and other kinds of knowledge acquisition. Okay, once we adopt a conceptual scheme, we want to distinguish between what are generally called internal and external questions. Going back to biological classifications, you might ask, but what is it really like out there? What's the correct scheme? Is it animals, vegetables, and protists? Or is it this more elaborate scheme I found out about on Wikipedia? What's it really like out there? And the answer is, we can't ask that external question. We can only ask which scheme works better for pragmatic purposes. And once we adopt the scheme, we deal with internal questions, questions that we ask from within the scheme. So if you're taking biology, right, proper biology, not the high school biology that I took, right, you take a test, right, and you ask questions like how many kingdoms or whatever, and there are right and wrong answers, and you are graded accordingly, because once you're inside that scheme, there's not much wiggle room. Or again, consider the question, are there numbers? Okay? Now, you could ask, what is there in the world? Right? Quite apart from any systems of mathematics. What is there out in the world? Are there numbers? And if so, what are they? Are they Platonic forms? Are they inscriptions? Are they sets of sets? Okay? Now, those external questions are mysterious. In another sense, if we operate within the system, within the conceptual scheme, of course there are numbers. There's a number, there's a natural number between 1 and 3. Okay? There's an even prime, 2. Of course there are numbers, but when we say that, we're speaking within the system. We're playing the game. Okay? And when we play the game, okay, we play by the rules. Outside the game, it makes no sense to ask which moves are correct. It depends what game you're playing. Outside the game, we cannot answer that question any more than we can answer the question, how many things are there? Okay? But once we get inside the game, once we decide on the game, and we decide on pragmatic grounds, we play the game that suits our purposes best. Right? There are correct and incorrect moves. And since we're playing a social game here, and operating within this conceptual scheme, players have to agree on the rules, or else there's no game. So this, as I say, is the kind of view that I think is pretty generic, that has a lot of sympathy among philosophers. And the motto is, who cares what games we choose, right? We choose our games for pragmatic reasons, little to win and nothing to lose. So to go back to the question we began with, the buzzing, blooming confusion, what we do faced by experience, that buzzing, blooming confusion. Well, we have to play some game, or else we're back to the blooming, buzzing confusion. And we can't say anything. We can just sort of lie there and grunt, right? Right? So we gotta play. And which game we play? Well, for pragmatic purposes, some games are better than others. And we're evolving, and we're getting better and better and better games. And for pragmatic purposes, furthermore, you must play the game that others play, because the business of operating in the world, the business of advancing knowledge, the business of doing science is a social business, right? It's something that we do together. And finally, okay, hit it. As I say, my text came from the strawberry alarm clock. And there they are. Come back in my time. And now we can discuss. So thank you very much.
This question concerns Foucault. While I'm sort of sympathetic with you, and I am, and it's like, I wonder if it's not really about the nature of the visible and the invisible in this sense. I wonder whether structure is necessary before you could criticize the structure. And then if you didn't have the structure to begin with, then everything is sort of like everything. That came to me when I was undergraduate in the early 70s. I had a friend who was a bit of a provocateur. He was the guardian to his nieces. They were at that time aged between 9 and 13. And he once gave him a talk about something. I forgot exactly what it was, but it was something that upset me a little bit. And I said, I pulled him aside and I said, why did you do that? He said, we live in a world of indoctrination. And the only thing you could do is give them counter-indoctrination. So when they grow up, they understand how to weave between the different indoctrination. And I told him I disapproved. I didn't say it in front of the kids. I said I disapprove because it seems to me it takes a lot of sophistication to understand that you live in a world of indoctrination, and you have to build a structure first for them to understand that there are anti-structures, right? And so I'm wondering whether that doesn't apply to Foucault in the sense that it takes a lot of sophistication to get to the point of understanding the relationship between the visible and the invisible. And so without that to begin with, how do you arrive at that point? You just can't give it to them right from the beginning.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, I'm not trying to be coy. I think like the answer's in the question, right? I mean, I think you've kind of given the answer. You know, Foucault's kind of doing the work himself, having become already familiar with the structures of trying to expose what the kind of contrarian structures, the anti-structures, the anomalous structures might be. Yeah, and I think that there's a sense in which that's right. And so like, it's partly why I have a hard time kind of identifying his view of truth. I mean, we can play this kind of a question in a slightly similar way. We can say, hey, look, a critique of language requires a mastery of the language being critiqued, or the reliability of the language in which the critique of language is expressed, and so on, right? And so I think that that's probably true. I think it's a clever way to put an abstract point, so thank you.
Something about the discourse, the idea of communication in society, being moved to the digital realm. We're now talking about messaging that is in a world that's no longer real, it's artificial. We talk about fake news, we talk about fictitious identities. I'm wondering how we can apply this conversation, this discourse, this analysis to today's functioning through the online media. As far as depth of truth and people actually existing within a world that is completely artificial make-believe that doesn't relate to what you might call objective reality.
I'm not sure who you're asking, but I can take that. Okay, well, I mean, if we're reasonable, we can sort out the good sources from the bad sources. We can appeal to authority because some people are better at some things than others, and we recognize them as being better at some things than others by their various credentials. So we look for those who are experts, and we trust them. We trust doctors rather than witch doctors, herbalists, or whatever. Right? We trust vaccines because they're scientifically proven and so on. So, I mean, if you're naive, you may just look at the internet and not discriminate, but if you're reasonably sophisticated, you recognize the distinction between the baloney, the fake news, the conspiracy theories, and the mainline expert endorsed correct views of reality, those which figure within the best conceptual scheme that we have available.
Yeah, I think the only thing that I would want to add to that is to say, like, there are two different ways to kind of think about this within the postmodern tradition. On the one hand, kind of a much more radical view about the fact that there aren't really any stable identities to any particular individual or subject. This view gets pushed very far into the work of somebody like Jean Baudrillard, who thinks that, like, we're living in an age of simulacra or simulation. And so for him, like, this is actually quite naturally the outgrowth of the fact that, you know, there's really no meaning or transcendent meaning behind the kinds of truth claims that we make. There are no identities that are fixed and stable behind the roles or categories according to which we identify ourselves. And that there really just is all self-referential text. And so you can kind of go in a very radical way if you want to read Baudrillard on simulacra. The other thing that one might say about this is that we could say, like, hey, here's something interesting about the inability to properly circumscribe, say, the marginalized or the excluded. And that is to say that if we can't properly circumscribe it, then we can introduce all sorts of peculiar characters, traits, avatars, fake imposters, and so on, since we can't kind of identify the true voice of criticism from the false or apparent voice of criticism. You know, so there's a kind of a critical way of taking that question as well. Yeah. Tim, you were first, and then the other fellow. Sorry, I don't know your name.
So I have I guess I'm Professor Baber. I'm very sympathetic toward both pragmatism, and I love the strawberry alarm clock. So I'm hesitant to say anything critical, but I guess
The sound is good.
the song's in my head now, so that's okay.
Into it.
The thing that I'm wondering is, you say, in quoting the strawberry alarm clock, you say, you know, who cares what games we choose? And I'm wondering if pragmatism falls prey to Professor Kelly's critique of postmodernism, insofar as there seems to be no basis upon which to choose which games sort of we are playing, which obviously if we're talking chess or checkers is immaterial, but if we're talking the game of, say, colonialism or decolonialism, there are incredibly high stakes to which sort of game we choose. And is there anything from within pragmatism to help us make those choices, or is it just will to power that sort of leads us to make those choices?
We're playing in a different ballpark, because when I talk about conceptual schemes, I'm not talking about politics. You can't deduce ought from is. I'm not talking about those ought questions. I'm talking about more fundamental questions, like, do you believe that the best way to classify the stuff of the world is according to the Greek scheme of fire, air, water, and earth? Or do you think that the kind of schemes suggested by the sciences currently are a better way of classifying things? Do you believe in cars and out cars, or do you want to classify things as cars? So I'm not talking about any value issues at all. And contrary to what the postmodernists believe, I believe that you can absolutely separate questions of value from questions of fact. So I'm just talking about these very fundamental questions. For physiology, do you go with the four humors theory, sanguine, and whatever the other ones are, melancholic? Or do you have a more contemporary scheme, such as the best contemporary scientists would espouse? And as I say, I was thinking about, there's a real skepticism about expertise, right? But when it comes to, for example, dentistry, right? You're going to trust Suzanne Tulenko, DDS, you're not going to trust some guy with pliers, right?
I feel like I'm going to try to push Harriet's position to come at the question in a slightly different way. There's a sense in which in the pragmatic tradition we kind of do have a definition of truth, right? The pragmatic tradition has a committed definition of truth, and it always is what works. Right, so truth is what works. Okay, so then the question regarding the construal of truth is what works in the context of your inquiry, Tim, is to say, what works actually to produce, say, reconciliation? What works to produce retributive justice? What works to produce restorative justice? What works to produce equality? What works to produce freedom? Right, in those questions. So how do we do that? Right. Well, it's complicated there because the what works question then requires us to kind of appeal back to certain kinds of values, right, or to certain kinds of conceptions of truth that in some sense kind of go beyond the what works questions. Say we want to kind of promote the value of equity or equality, or promote the value of justice. Then we're back into the same problem that we're kind of appealing to Enlightenment paradigms that postmodernism itself actually denies and wants to reject. And so we're again at an impasse in this case. That's my view on the matter anyhow, right? So you can say, hey, look, truth is what works. What are we going to do about correcting the institutions in our society so that they better promote peace, justice, and equality? But now we're back in the Enlightenment view, and the postmodernist is bothered by the fact that we are back there. So I don't know where we go from there. Yeah.
Okay. I just want to talk just briefly about Darwin. Wrote the book Origin of Species, and in a certain reading of Darwin, I suppose you could say that what is the origin of species? The origin of species is the science of taxonomy. He talks about how difficult it is to distinguish a variety from a species and a species from a genus, and try and classify, so that's sort of like the name game, so to speak, but yet Darwin doesn't just talk about taxonomy. He doesn't talk about classifying or different methods of classifying. He talks about evolution, which is something that doesn't show itself directly when you observe species interacting with nature. It's something that is there that sort of shows itself in an obscure way. So that what we have out there is we don't have a confused mass or a buzzing reality. What we have is something that's obscure, that is something out of which things emerge. So my question is can postmodernism be seen as the pursuit of truth in the sense of truth as something that's primordial, something that does not show itself directly, but which, from out of which things emerge, whether it's animals or whether it's physics or whether it's politics, instead of truth being a transcendental objectivity, it's something that is primordial and obscure. So I guess that would be for both of you or you.
Yeah, I mean, Harry, do you want to say something about that? Or, I mean, I think that I have something I want to say about this. So, look, it goes back to my opening remark. I mean, like, if postmodernism wants to kind of identify a particular type of truth that it's being critical of, then we can have a better way to kind of get a hold of what its claims are, how to evaluate them, and actually then kind of move forward into these kinds of bigger epistemological questions like the one that you're introducing. Now, that particular question, I think, invokes a difference between, say, something like in the phenomenological tradition, which is not postmodernist, and I think largely will deny the premises that postmodernism starts with. We're going to draw a distinction between what's called the truth of correctness, which is the truth of propositions, the kinds of things that Harriet largely is talking about. So the cat is on the mat is true if indeed the cat is on the mat, right? And then we're going to have another kind of truth that we're going to talk about as the truth of disclosure, the ways in which things manifest themselves to us that are not subordinate to the truth of propositions or the truth of correctness. But there, in some sense, like we've still actually kind of subscribed to, endorsed a vision of the way things are, that is to say the truth. And if postmodernism is not going to endorse that, then I think the conversation again reaches an impasse. That's my kind of quick response to your question. I hope it helps.
Truth is uncovered in this.
Yeah, truth of, right, that's it in the Heideggerian sense. Truth is disclosure, truth is aletheia, truth is unconcealment. That's right.
Yeah, we collaborated, and I learned a lot because I never read any of these guys like Foucault and Derrida and whatnot. And here they are ranting about there is no truth. I have a suspicion that within their tradition, they're responding to people like Hegel or whatever who have these grand world schemes, these sort of a priori development of the absolute realizing itself, yada, yada. But this kind of view, Foucault, et cetera, never really took off in the Anglosphere because we were never really committed to that stuff, or we never really cared about that stuff in the first place. And when we talk about truth, all this, I forget what the terminology we're using. Truth just means the cat is on the mat, 2 + 2 = 4. It's all very prosaic. It has nothing to do with these grand schemes.